This is the mighty Saturn V, which to this day is the only rocket to take astronauts beyond low Earth orbit. For all you millennials out there, you no doubt pin all your hopes and dreams on Elon Musk to take your generation to the moon and beyond. But to all you baby boomers out there, going to the moon is old hat, right? I'm sure every boomer remembers Project Apollo, not to mention where they were on Christmas Eve 1968. That's because it was the night the crew of Apollo 8 made history by beating the Russians to the moon. While the three-man crew of Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders never set foot on the lunar surface, they were the first men to orbit the moon. Not many people remember Apollo 8 since it was overshadowed by the first moon landing of Apollo 11, not to mention the ill-fated Apollo 13 mission that almost ended in disaster. The crazy thing is that Apollo 8 was without a doubt the diciest U.S. manned space shot of all time. The mission was never supposed to go anywhere near the moon. The second of 7 steps toward putting an American on the lunar surface, the space shot was slated to test the LEM in low Earth orbit. Hell, it was only the second time that a crew had even flown in an Apollo spacecraft. There were a number of imponderables that had yet to be resolved to get any crew safely to the moon and back. So what caused the cautious powers that be at NASA to throw caution to the wind? Would you believe the CIA? That's right, the same cloak and dagger agency that brought you the Bay of Pigs convinced NASA to alter the course of history. The CIA's sister agency, the National Reconnaissance Office, had shown them some startling surveillance photos taken at the Baikonur Cosmodrome where a huge rocket had been wheeled out to the launch pad. It didn't take NRO image analysts long to realize that the 35-story rocket they were looking at could only be the Soviet Union's answer to NASA's Saturn V. Quickly meeting with NASA administrators, the CIA convinced them that if the U.S. didn't want to end up second banana in the race to the moon, it was now or never. When the 3 astronauts who'd been training for an Earth orbital flight were asked if they were willing to make an attempt at lunar orbit, the 3 jumped at the chance. So sudden was the change of plans that the space agency was forced to carry what was called the LM test article, which took up the space where the lunar module would later be stowed. The reason for the dummy LEM was to keep the spacecraft weight identical to that of every following Apollo mission, so as not to alter the calculations necessary for lunar navigation. That being said, there were a lot of things that were still unknown about the Saturn V. Up to Apollo 8, the mighty Saturn V had only twice been flown in space, and in both cases a number of mission-critical anomalies were encountered. In its maiden 1968 flight, while the spacecraft made it into orbit, there were severe vibrations that were encountered in the spacecraft, and 2 of the 4 second-stage engines actually failed during the flight. In the second test, a leaky fuel line caused the spacecraft to shut down not 1, but 2 first-stage engines. It was only by gimbaling the remaining 3 that the spacecraft managed to limp into orbit. Now, the reason I'm telling you all this is because there are all kinds of reasons that taking a shot at the moon at this juncture was not only extremely dangerous for the 3 astronauts, but there were a number of systems involved in getting them safely there and back that had yet to be tested. Everything from the onboard navigation computer and space sextant used for navigation were untried. It was also uncertain of how well the astronauts would fare for a week in a tin can only slightly larger than a couple of phone booths. It turned out that while the space in the spacecraft was manageable, the noise created by the command module systems were such that none of the astronauts was able to get much sleep during the voyage. Yet somehow the 3 managed to overcome the difficulties of the arduous maiden voyage. One of the chief concerns was whether their untested onboard computer would be up to the task of getting them into and out of lunar orbit. So concerned about the computer was NASA that nobody knew for sure what to expect when the spacecraft went behind the moon for the first time. Out of communication with Earth, the whole flight hinged on a computer-assisted burn of the single-engine service module. If the burn failed, the spacecraft would have simply zipped past the moon into deep space. If it burned too long, Apollo 8 would have inevitably spiraled down to crash on the moon. Everyone at Mission Control held their breath until Jim Lovell announced as they came out of the moon's shadow, "There is a Santa Claus." That cryptic response told controllers that they could breathe easy since the burn had gone off without a hitch. While in lunar orbit, the astronauts held a televised press conference where they showed the viewing public images of both the moon in close-up and the faraway image of Earth floating in the blackness of space. The Christmas Eve telecast also saw all three astronauts read from the book of Genesis, and Mission Commander Frank Borman closed out the broadcast by saying, "From the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good Earth." While the success of this mission was a result of the ill-fated attempt by Russia to land a man on the moon, none of the four N-1 rockets that would eventually be erected on the Baikonur launch pad ever made it into orbit. In 1974, after the fourth failed attempt to launch, the Russian manned moon landing was canceled by the Kremlin. In essence, that one small step of Apollo 8 led directly to the giant leap taken a year later by Neil Armstrong. It also led to the Russians throwing in the towel when it came to putting a cosmonaut on the moon. If you liked this webisode and love mysteries, make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel and check out my Patreon page. Who knows what mystery I'll reveal to you next week? Make sure you're in the loop.